Every so often, a game comes along that changes the landscape of the medium for years to come. A game that sets a trend, that defines a genre, and that influences the direction of every game that follows. During the days of the arcade, it was games like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong. For the NES, it was Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. For the 16-bit generation, it was Sonic the Hedgehog. And for 3D gaming in the late 90s, it was Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII was one of the most massive video game projects of its day, with development spanning over 3 years in total and involving the work of over 100 employees, a number that was frankly ludicrous for the time. For comparison, the biggest video game of 1996, Super Mario 64, was made with a team of around 30 or so. FF7's budget was an exorbitant $40 million. Adjusted for inflation, that would be roughly $80 million today, making it one of the most expensive game projects yet seen. Square had decided to go full 3D with this one, a move that even they saw as a fairly big risk, especially since it eventually meant they would cut ties with longtime partner Nintendo. The memory limitations of the N64's cartridges meant Square's ambitions for the game simply couldn't be achieved on the console. As a result, Square defected to Sony, and Nintendo did not take kindly to the split, reportedly telling Square at the time, "Don't ever come back." Sony, recognizing a good thing when they had it, poured a tremendous amount of money and effort into marketing the newest Final Fantasy title, particularly in the West. And they didn't stop at just marketing to gamers. Massive full-spread print ads inhabited sports and television magazines, and trailers for the game were screened in cinemas ahead of Hollywood films.
The most anticipated epic adventure of the year will never come to a theater near you.
While it isn't unusual to see video game trailers in the movie theater nowadays, it was unprecedented in 1997. This type of media attention being heaped onto an RPG was quite unusual, period. The genre had thus far been notoriously difficult to market to a mainstream audience, in large part because their slower, more strategic, text-driven nature simply lacked the mass appeal of other games, and in large part because the longer playtimes the genre typically produced meant the cartridges themselves were more expensive, since all that extra RAM usually required more complicated boards and chipsets. Games like Chrono Trigger or Illusion of Gaia were using a hell of a lot more RAM than, say, NBA Jam. Sony, though, thanks to the inherently inexpensive nature of CD-ROMs, leaned into the angle of the game having a massive amount of content by touting that FF7 was not only one of the first PlayStation games to span more than one disc, but also the first to span 3 discs. And it doesn't take long after booting up the game to realize how Final Fantasy VII was able to make RPGs appealing on a surface level. The game just cranked up the production values like crazy. Final Fantasy VII is packed to the brim with pre-rendered CG cutscenes, arguably the most detailed and complex the medium had ever seen. Keep in mind that this was only 2 years after Toy Story, the first ever CG animated film. The now iconic opening shot, zooming out from a small dark alley to eventually reveal a breathtaking wide shot of the city of Midgar, was the sort of cinematography that Hollywood filmmakers could only dream of back in 1997. But it goes beyond just the cinematics. The entire game is presented in incredibly detailed pre-rendered backgrounds a la Resident Evil, sometimes transitioning seamlessly in and out of the FMVs themselves, with dynamic camera angles and shifting perspectives and 3D character models that scale in real time to match the camera's current angle and distance. The game lacks voice acting, but the dialogue boxes are all positioned as immersively as possible, occasionally even overlapping one another to simulate crowd noise or characters interrupting one another. Before this, RPGs weren't exactly a genre known for their graphics or production values. While there were a handful of exceptions, such as Secret of Mana and Chrono Trigger, that featured great art design and detailed sprites, RPGs typically were a genre that placed in-depth mechanics and storytelling above their visuals. FF7, however, proved that RPGs could be spectacular, they could be cutting-edge, they could be breathtaking cinematic experiences in their own right. And Sony knew what they were doing when it came to selling this game to Western consumers. If you look back at the game's American advertisements, you may notice that practically none of them show any actual gameplay, focusing almost exclusively on showing off the game's pre-rendered CG cutscenes. You'd be hard-pressed to find a US ad for Final Fantasy VII that actually shows the gameplay, not even a simple screenshot. And this was almost definitely intentional on Sony's part. Heck, not even the back of the box shows any of the actual, RPG parts. People were buying Final Fantasy VII who had never even heard of RPGs before, and thus many were learning the genre for the first time. One anecdote from a former editor at Game Informer recounted a tale of working at a Funko Land in Kentucky in 1997 and having a customer return FF7 because he, quote, didn't know there would be reading in it. Nowadays, this sort of borderline deceptive marketing would almost certainly be heavily scrutinized. In fact, the term bullshotting was coined to describe this specific type of deceptive game ad, and game commercials nowadays are obligated to point out when the footage being shown is pre-rendered as opposed to real gameplay. But in FF7's case, this was a bold and risky move that ended up working out in the long run. At a time when game publishers pondered, how do you market role-playing games to an audience that historically doesn't care about RPGs, Sony replied, easy, just don't market it as an RPG. Make no mistake though, Final Fantasy VII is every bit as much an RPG as other Final Fantasies were. Perhaps the biggest influence on FF7's gameplay is its most immediate predecessor, Final Fantasy VI. In 3D, polygons are limited, so party size has been reduced from 4 characters to 3, and there are fewer available party members in total, 9 as opposed to FF6's 14, with each party member having a fixed weapon type and slightly different base stats. But nonetheless, gameplay seems almost one-to-one the same in most instances, and in fact quite a bit of it has been simplified. For one, most status effects aren't permanent, being automatically healed when battle is over. And for another, characters not in the active party still gain a fraction of the EXP earned. More notably, however, is that party members are now given only 3 pieces of equipment in total: 1 weapon, 1 armor, and 1 accessory. There are no shields, helms, or gauntlets, just a vague and unspecified armor slot. While this may seem like a step backwards at first glance, this was done to facilitate the central mechanic that forms the crux of FF7's character building: Materia. Materia is like a combination of the Magicite from FF6 combined with the traditional Final Fantasy Job System. Whereas the Magicite crystals in FF6 would teach a character a specific set of magic spells once they had gained enough magic points, Materia takes this same basic concept and provides a more piecemeal, more precisely customizable experience. Materia can be equipped to empty slots in each character's weapon or armor. Each materia will initially only grant the equipped character a single spell, say, Fire. But as AP is gained from battle, materia will level up and grant additional spells of the same school, in this case Fire 2 and Fire 3. In cases where new spells aren't learned, leveling a materia will instead increase the spell's strength or efficacy, such as the case with summon spells, for instance. When a materia reaches max level, it splits into a fresh new level 1 materia of the same type, meaning that with enough time, the player can create duplicates of whatever spells they need. In contrast to Final Fantasy VI, where the Magicite was simply a means for characters to permanently learn new spells, in Final Fantasy VII, materia essentially are the spells. The player must also be conscious about overloading characters with too many spells, as while each magic materia grants boosts to a character's MP and magic stats, they also penalize their HP and offensive stats in return. But materia isn't just limited to spells. Any battle action that isn't the standard attack or item commands requires materia in order to use. Commands that would traditionally be associated with particular jobs, such as steal, rapid fire, and enemy skills, are now all tied to materia. In addition to basic magic and command materia, there are also support and independent materia. Independent materia grant passive abilities, such as counterattacks, stat boosts, or increases to gil or EXP gain, with the effects being multiplied or made more common as the materia levels up. Support materia does nothing on its own, but when paired with a magic or command materia in a linked slot, it can enhance the attached materia in various ways. For instance, the All materia will allow an attached magic materia to target multiple enemies at once a fixed number of times per fight. The Elemental or Added Effect materia will imbue the attached weapon or armor with the specified element or status conditions, and the Sneak Attack materia will cause the character to perform the attached action right at the start of battle without using up a turn. Essentially, the materia system acts as the job system, but offered a la carte. If you want a character to be a mage, you can load them up with a bunch of spells and put them in the back row to blast enemies from afar. If you want a character to be a monk, a bunch of HP ups and a counterattack materia will get the job done. Want to make a good Mystic Knight? Attach a bunch of spells to your weapons, paired with elementals and added effects, and voila! This essentially allows any character to fill any roles you need for any given situation. The other major new mechanic in FF7 comes in the form of limit breaks. Similar to Materia, limit breaks take an idea from FF6 and expand on it, in this case, desperation moves. In FF6, each character had a unique, super powerful desperation move, but given that they would only be activated at random whenever the character used a physical attack while in critical health, it's very likely that players could get through the entire game without seeing a single one. In FF7, though, limit breaks are now a core element of the battle system. Each character has a limit gauge in battle that fills as they take more damage, and when that gauge is full, their standard attack command is replaced with their limit break, super powerful and flashy moves that deal massive amounts of damage or inflict various helpful effects. And to top it all off, limit breaks will always take their turn immediately, regardless of the current turn order. Each character has anywhere from 2 to 7 limit breaks they can learn, with stronger limits being unlocked by using the weaker ones enough times, or by defeating a certain number of enemies. Setting a character to their stronger limit breaks will mean the gauge takes longer to fill, and so there can be a certain amount of strategy in intentionally keeping a character set to their lower levels, so they can activate limits more often. While Final Fantasy VII mechanically and structurally sticks very close to FF6's blueprint, the setting and storytelling of FF7 stands out quite a lot compared to prior entries. In place of the traditional medieval swords and sorcery of older Final Fantasy titles, FF7 is set in a grungy sort of techno-future that this franchise had never really seen before. Sure, Final Fantasy VI had introduced slightly more modern technology like trains, chainsaws, and crossbows, but the world of Final Fantasy VII is less steampunk and more full-on cyberpunk. We see more or less a modern-day society with cars, helicopters, and rocket ships. Instead of our heroes rising up to overthrow a corrupt empire, we instead have a group of evil, power-hungry CEOs. The story pushes a very in-your-face environmentalist message via the primary source of conflict running through much of the game's plot. The Shinra Electric Power Company, a corporation so corrupt with power and greed that it has essentially become the de facto government and military of the entire world. FF7's visual style was a big change for the series at the time. Regular collaborator Yoshitaka Amano stayed on to design the game's logo and general concept art, but the bulk of the character design duties were this time passed along to Tetsuya Nomura, who had previously worked as a monster designer on FF5 and 6. His more contemporary manga-style artwork was considered a better fit for the game's graphics, as Amano's paintings, with their watercolors, excessive focus on minute details and accessories, and wispy dreamlike line work, were notoriously difficult to translate into 3D renders. For the first time in the franchise, FF7 could have an abundance of asymmetrical character designs because they had actual 3D models, and didn't have to worry about saving space by recycling assets for left and right-facing sprites. Once you look past all the pizzazz and spectacle, though, you may start to notice that Final Fantasy VII doesn't exactly take a lot of risks when it comes to the actual game design. While the graphics and presentation took a huge leap between console generations, the gameplay itself feels like much more of a lateral move. One could go so far as to describe FF7's basic gameplay as essentially a 3D FF6. This feels very of the era when you think about it. In making the jump from 2D to 3D, which is such a massive paradigm shift in terms of even the most fundamental design concepts, many franchises were more concerned with simply finding their footing in the third dimension before they would be comfortable enough to try to revolutionize the gameplay itself. Two of the most successful games of the following year, Metal Gear Solid and Ocarina of Time, would both look to their most recent 2D entries as a blueprint, to the point where they could almost be described as remakes. In other words, Final Fantasy VI ran so that Final Fantasy VII could walk, and no, I didn't get that backwards. A lot of FF7's basic gameplay is recycled from FF6, but just a little less good. Just about the only thing I think was a 100% objective improvement over the previous game was limit breaks, since FF6's desperation moves were such a rare occurrence that they may as well not even exist. It makes sense when you think about it. FF6 was the culmination of 2 generations worth of RPGs, whereas FF7 was created as the team was trying to learn new hardware, with a style of presentation and storytelling that had never really been attempted by the medium before. Nonetheless, one thing that sticks out to me whenever I replay FF7 is how each aspect of the game gets something just a little bit wrong. It's not enough to ruin the game as a complete package or anything, but it's a feeling a lot of early 3D games share. Everything is just a bit jank. And that's kind of a result of that specific era of gaming. Every early 3D game was just a little bit jank. I even brought this up in my Mario 64 video. That game is wonderful and groundbreaking and influential, but just by sheer nature of being a trailblazer, it inevitably suffers from just a healthy dose of jank. And FF7 is much the same way. With every decision the game makes in an earnest attempt to break the mold and innovate, a sacrifice is made in return. Probably most obvious is the game's overall look. While these graphics were groundbreaking for an RPG from 1997, the game began to look severely dated by as early as the following year. Which honestly says something about just how quickly games were evolving back then, but nevertheless, I feel like even the most staunch, hardcore fans of Final Fantasy VII will agree that these graphics are hard to sell in the modern day. And recommending the game to newcomers usually involves easing them in with some warning along the lines of, keep in mind that this was an early PS1 game. The game's environments and pre-rendered backgrounds are incredibly immersive and detailed, but they were also clearly designed to look good first and foremost, and so a lot of them can feel cluttered and confusing to actually navigate. It's sometimes difficult to tell what's an entrance and what isn't, where you can walk and where you can't, and what's interactable and what isn't. The directional inputs can also often completely change from screen to screen, like I'm pretty sure left moved me down at one point. More than a few areas of the game can feel like an MC Escher painting, and it seems like the devs caught on to this problem at some point. Hey, if your game has to devote a controller button to pointing out where your own character is on screen, maybe take that as a sign that you should probably rethink how you've laid out some of these maps. The characters and enemies were all given large and detailed models for battle scenes, and they look great, but on the field, characters are presented in a squashed, exaggerated chibi style, with flat, emotionless faces and weird Popeye arms and stubby little feet and legs. These were meant to mimic the same kind of big-headed character sprites common to RPGs of the prior generations, and while that effect definitely comes through when being shown these models from a distance, they start to fall apart as soon as the camera gets even a little bit close to them. The game, visually, ends up as the franchise's awkward puberty between FF6's excellent 2D sprites and FF8's realistic 3D models. It's really no wonder that some of the most common FF7 fan mods on Steam are ones that update or replace the character models with more detailed or realistically proportioned alternatives. The game is also really inconsistent with those character models, too, particularly as far as the FMVs are concerned. In one moment, the CG cutscenes could use the larger and more detailed characters, and then the next to switch back to the squashed Cupid dolls. It's jarring, and makes the game's otherwise high production value feel just a little bit slipshod. The game's soundtrack, as blasphemous as it may be to say this, is one that I have mixed feelings on. The compositions are all great, don't get me wrong. Nobuo Uematsu is back and in top form, delivering some real all-timers. The opening bombing mission gets your heart pumping. The game's main theme is fantastic, probably my favorite main theme in the franchise. And every single battle theme is a winner, from the standard encounters, to the boss fights, to the otherworldly Genova, and of course, the absolutely iconic final boss theme, One-Winged Angel. The story behind that last one in particular is really interesting, by the way. Uematsu wrote the song in a rather unorthodox way, just writing random bars and phrases separately as they came to mind, and then once he had about a dozen or so written out, he would try to find a way to work them all together into one cohesive composition. The song is as brilliant as it is unusual, and there's a good reason it stuck around in the cultural zeitgeist for so long. No, my issues with FF7's soundtrack have nothing to do with the music itself. It mainly comes down to one thing: choice of sound font. Now, just to be clear, a sound font refers to specific types of instrument samples used when creating music with a digital synthesizer. Synthesizers were commonly used throughout the early generations of video games, as early tech often meant games couldn't play pre-recorded music, and instead had to synthesize it using the console's built-in sound chip. Different games could use different sound fonts, different instruments, so to speak, depending on the specific type of synthesizers the music composer or sound engineers would choose. While I'm no expert in the subject, the specific sound font used in FF7 has always sounded off to me, and I can't really put my finger on why. It all sounds kinda tinny, warbled, and dissonant. One could argue that perhaps this was the intent, to symbolize the oppressive industrial hold that Shinra has over the game's world. But if that's the case, why do areas that are notably free of Shinra's influence, such as Cosmo Canyon and Wutai, still use the same metallic, echoey sounds? It's just something I've never been able to fully embrace. And while I love FF7's music when it's performed using live instruments, the music as it is in-game is not something I can say I 100% enjoy, outside of the nostalgia of it all. The game's battles also feel like they suffered a bit from the transition to full 3D. From early on in development, the team was made aware of the fact that they could only have a limited number of polygons on screen at once, which was one of the major factors in cutting this game's party size down from 4 characters to 3. But the CD-ROM nature of the PlayStation also meant the game would require load times, and the developers also seemed to get a bit drunk on excess when it came to the theatrical potential of 3D graphics. The camera swoops and weaves to create a more cinematic experience throughout, and while this can be turned off in the options menu, it does mean that the battle frame rates are pretty choppy to account for it all. I'll attest that the game's in-battle graphics and animations are still genuinely impressive today despite the low frame rate, but those animations can get pretty long. You can expect anything that isn't a standard physical attack or basic spell to last several seconds, with most summon spells averaging at around 30. In fact, the Knights of the Round summon infamously lasts nearly a minute and a half, during which time no other actions can be taken. The battles even have some utilitarian issues, as even when the camera is standing still, selecting the intended target based on their current position can be like solving a puzzle, which is a problem in a game where every second spent selecting a target is another second you're left vulnerable. When all is said and done, it probably isn't much of an exaggeration to say that the average battle in FF6 can play out in its entirety in the amount of time it takes for a battle in FF7 to start, and I'm not sure the snazzy attack animations are worth that trade-off. And just in case I haven't made enough enemies already, let me say I'm not even the biggest fan of the game's Materia system. While the Materia can be an incredibly fulfilling customization method that allows you to build your party members however you want with an unprecedented amount of specificity, it also sorta makes your choice of party members feel kinda irrelevant, right? A character without Materia can't do anything other than the basic attack and item commands, and aside from each party member having slightly different base stat builds, the only things really setting each one apart is their choice of weapon and their limit breaks. Over the course of the game, it's not your party members learning new spells, the Materia does. This essentially turns your materia into the real party members, and your actual playable characters just become a bunch of interchangeable coat hangers lined with empty materia slots. I feel like the intention with the materia system is that players will assign each character a specific role in battle and then equip materia pertaining to those roles, allowing them to swap around characters to accomplish whatever their current objective is. And when you play the game that way, like I did for this playthrough, I can definitely see the beauty in that. Limiting each party member to only the materia relevant to their chosen roles means a lot more thought is put into your party choices at any given moment. But from my experience, that is not how the majority of people play Final Fantasy VII. It seems to me that most people just overload the most useful materia they have onto whatever characters they favor willy-nilly. And while I'm sure some appreciate that they can, in theory, play through this game using just their favorite characters, it does take away some of the interesting strategizing when your choices aren't really about which character is best for the current situation, but rather which ones have the most empty slots available. While I have my issues with the FF7 remakes, this is one thing about them that I'll likely always prefer. Each character actually plays differently on their own, meaning they're less reliant on materia, and the player has to put more thought into which specific character they use at which specific times. It feels like FF7 is trying to have its cake and eat it too. Like, what's the point of Yuffie being a thief or Tifa being a monk if they can't use thief or monk specific skills without using up a materia slot first? With prior Final Fantasy games, if the party members were a bunch of blank slates for the player to build however they wish, like in 2, 3, and 5, then that cast of characters was largely the same for the whole game. If the party members were given unique roles and abilities, like in 4 and 6, then the cast would rotate out, either via story events or at the player's discretion. Final Fantasy VII, though, tries to do both, and kinda ends up with neither. But perhaps the most egregious of FF7's jank, the game's English localization is one of the messiest I've ever seen from a AAA game project. I should note, I can completely understand that the scale of this game and the amount of text it entailed was practically unheard of back then, and the translation and localization was a massive project that required a team of around 50 people. The process was constantly riddled with issues, namely inexperience from the translators — Ted Woolsey had long left Square by this point — lack of professional editors, and poor communication from the Japanese staff. The most prevailing result of this was the spelling of Aerith's name. Intended to be a portmanteau of the words air and earth, it was mistakenly spelled Eris in the final game due to a mistake on the QA team's side. And have you ever wondered what the W in W item, W magic, and W summon means? Well, it actually means double. Since double and W are pronounced nearly identically, the Japanese text used the English letter W as a sort of abbreviation. The English localizers, for whatever reason, retained this literally, even though it makes considerably less sense in an English context. So some choices were made quite deliberately. The Japanese script regularly featured characters swearing, and these instances were largely kept intact in English to preserve the original intent. Although not completely unscathed, as in order to keep the game at a teen rating, many of the harsher swears were censored with this comic book-style symbol text. This honestly adds a weird sort of charm, and I don't really mind it that much. And the game's very nonchalant use of the R slur in a handful of instances is something I can largely shrug off as simply a product of the times. Unfortunately, I can say from experience that we were all using that word back then. But the game's English script as a whole is still riddled with errors of all kinds. Some examples: not correctly identifying certain mythological references, such as the legendary Norse snake Midgard-Zormir being translated as Midgar-Zolom. Some items are called by multiple names, such as Megalixir at one point being called Last Elixir, and at one point using the English Final Fantasy VI term for ethers, tincture, to refer to standard potions. In-battle dialogue during the game's first boss is phrased so poorly that it appears to direct the player to attack during a time when it's actually unsafe to do so. And this isn't just an every-once-in-a-while thing, either. It's hard to go 5 or 10 text boxes in a row without some noticeable flub occurring. The game is absolutely rife with typos and weird misspellings, such as saying a character was coughed by surprise, or spelling the word tough with a P, or the infamous off course and this guy are sick. The translation also screws up a few of the game's finer plot points. Final Fantasy VII's story is fairly layered, and the translators unfortunately missed or misinterpreted a lot of its more nuanced moments. FF7 is still considered to have one of the most complex RPG plots, but you have to wonder how much of the confusion and debate over the game's story details is simply the result of people being unable to comprehend the game's at times nonsensical English script. The silver lining to this is that in light of FF7's shoddy translation, paired with the similarly questionable quality of Final Fantasy Tactics localization from around the same time, Square would really buckle down on forming a high-quality translation team with proper editors, meaning future projects from the studio wouldn't face quite so many issues. Luckily, the overall story of Final Fantasy VII is strong enough to pull through a lackluster translation, and despite all the issues I have with the game when I stop to think about it, all those issues kinda disappear once I boot up the game and actually start playing. If you ask me, every game should strive to have an opening as strong as Final Fantasy VII's. Honestly, more RPGs need to be willing to start their stories in media res. The cliche always goes that RPGs open in some quiet remote village and task the player with collecting groceries or finding kittens or whatever, but FF7 opens with the main character participating in a blatant act of eco-terrorism. When people played the FF7 demo included with Tobal No. 1, the game's opening 20 minutes were more than enough to get people hyped. FF6 started in the thick of things as well, but that game's opening went for a more subdued and mysterious feeling, whereas this one goes all in on over-the-top thrills and theatrics. It might be one of the most masterfully executed opening sequences ever. The entire first act of the game, set in the futuristic city of Midgar, might be the most well-paced and engaging opening chapter to any video game I've ever played. The absolute immaculate pacing of FF7's opening chapter is why FF7 Remake still bothers me despite all the things I liked about it. Like, was there anyone on God's green earth who played the original FF7 and said to themselves, yeah, this is cool and all, but you know it would make it even better? If the story screeched to a halt every so often so that we could see Cloud find lost cats and collect bill payments for a few hours. In the original game, the setting, the conflict, the major characters, and the basic rules of the gameplay are all introduced to the player naturally and at a brisk but comfortable pace, without talking down, without holding your hand, and without bogging things down with extraneous tutorials and needless side excursions. And the tutorials that do show up are also cleverly framed within the narrative as our main character giving advice to the other party members, or NPCs. After all, Cloud is a former military soldier, and so it wouldn't make much sense for battles to be explained to him, right? Midgar is also one of the most interesting and well-fleshed-out settings in a video game outside of, like, Neverwinter. The writers and art designers went out of their way to both describe and depict the divided populace of the city, split between the wealthy and well-off who live a literally elevated life up on the plates, and the people of the slums below, who, thanks to the suspended metal above them, are deprived of even the simple pleasures of natural sunlight or greenery. The majority of the game's first act takes place right in the thick of the slums, really driving home how desperate and destitute Shinra has left the average citizens of Midgar. And of course, the striking visual concept of a futuristic cyberpunk city hundreds of feet in the air on a giant metal pizza is just such a creative aesthetic. While the idea of a ragtag group of rebels rising up against a corrupt, power-hungry world leader is definitely nothing new for Final Fantasy, FF7 infuses it all with a real grit and grime that makes it all feel like a huge breath of fresh air. Unfortunately, though, the game eventually leaves Midgar. And to be clear, this moment was a big deal to many a gamer back then. A lot of people playing Final Fantasy VII at the time weren't well versed in the typical tropes of an RPG, and were thus unfamiliar with the concept of a game having a larger world map outside of maybe a Zelda game. And with the way the story presents Midgar in that first act, it was easy for a lot of people to assume that the entirety of the game would be set within the city. In fact, that seems to have been the plan at one point. Early drafts of FF7's story revolved around a New York City detective, a concept that would later form the basis of Square's horror RPG, Parasite Eve. And while this was ultimately dropped from this game for being too radical a departure from the typical Final Fantasy settings, those vibes can still be felt any time the player is within the city of Midgar. The moment the party leaves Midgar and the game reveals a full open map was a moment that blew a lot of people's minds back then. I've known and heard of many a person who got to the end of the Midgar segment and assumed they were approaching the game's climax, only to realize that this actually meant the game was really only beginning. But outside of Midgar, the game's so far impeccable pacing slows considerably. Story events begin to flow into one another a lot less naturally, a lot less seamlessly. Many of the locations the player visits feel a bit more arbitrary. Plot points start to feel a tad more contrived, and okay, I feel like nobody ever points this out, but like a third of this game's plot ends up being a wild goose chase. Have you ever thought about that? Like, the party travels the world searching for Sephiroth, thinking that he's somehow still alive, but it turns out, no, he's actually pretty dead. The party's actions only serve to aid his resurrection. Sephiroth returns as soon as the player visits every location on the world map, and then the actual plot starts up again as the player is granted the airship. It's like it was all one giant excuse for the game to even have a larger world map in the first place. I wouldn't say the game's plot would be better if it were set entirely in Midgar necessarily. In fact, exploring other locations that are less affected by Shinra's reach establishes to the audience exactly how much damage the company has caused and what is ultimately at stake if they're left unopposed. But so much of this game, in hindsight, feels like padding. Like the game designers are being pressured to stretch out the game's minimum playtime. And one of the most egregious ways in which they did so was by putting annoying minigames and QuickTime events around every corner. There's a bike chase minigame, a CPR minigame, a parade marching minigame, a chocobo racing minigame, a submarine minigame, a minecart minigame, and that's just to name a few. And every single one of those that I just mentioned is required in order to move the story along. It's all just kinda nonsense, if you ask me. Not to mention, some of these minigames are placed at points in the story that result in them being completely tone-deaf. Barrett's lifelong friend and father of the child he's been raising just committed suicide. Oh, that sucks. Let's race on the back of yellow ostriches while goofy over-the-top bluegrass music plays. Oh, what's that? Aerith just suffered a tragic and heart-wrenching death? Well, guess that means it's time for snowboarding! Worse still, FF7's minigames become unfortunately much less optional for those looking to get the most out of the game, with high-end equipment and materia being locked behind this irritating or time-consuming side content rather than activities more befitting an RPG. Chocobo breeding is obtuse and time-consuming and really only feels like it was included in the game because Tamagotchi was a big deal at the time, so of course Square had to include some sort of virtual pet simulator, I guess. The dumb Fort Condor Castle Defense minigame where you have to constantly buy more troops is almost nothing but a giant waste of time and gil, as the battles are nearly impossible to lose unless you do literally nothing, and they offer no worthwhile rewards whatsoever. Battle Square is the only real exception, I think, testing the player's resourcefulness and strategic thinking through actual RPG gameplay instead of a bunch of save scumming and QuickTime events. But this tendency to lock the game's best items and equipment behind extraneous, infuriating side games would unfortunately become a trend in this franchise, with perhaps the worst offender being Final Fantasy X. So, FF7's minigames are intrusive at times and most of them aren't very good, but much like a lot of the game's other faults, that also is sort of a product of its time. With the exciting potential of CD-ROMs and 3D gaming, developers were putting gameplay cohesion on the back burner in favor of a sort of kitchen sink mentality, throwing whatever halfway interesting ideas they had at the wall just to see if any of them stuck. But here, it seems like the scenario writers and game planners had trouble deciding which events and content should be optional and which should not. Some segments of the game are pretty clearly vital to the plot, like Nibelheim, Rocket Town, and the Temple of the Ancients, but then you have areas like the Gold Saucer and Bone Village that feel like they should be side excursions, but are made mandatory for whatever reason. More than once in the Gold Saucer's case. Meanwhile, if you want to, say, learn the final bit of details about Cloud's backstory, you have to, completely unprompted and with no hint that you would need to do so, return to the basement of an optional dungeon you already cleared several hours ago for absolutely no reason. The game forces you to play stupid submarine and snowboarding minigames in order to progress the story, but a key flashback, absolutely vital to fully understanding the game's main character, is just as easily overlooked as the silly Wu-Tai side episode. What we end up with is a game that feels like it would be twice as interesting if it were half as long. And it's a shame, too, because Cloud and the rest of the Final Fantasy VII cast are all really interesting characters, and the story, when it's not just spinning its wheels at least, is genuinely intriguing. I know this term is overused these days, but this might be the most iconic RPG party in history. Even people who don't play RPGs, heck, people who don't even really play video games, probably know who Cloud or Tifa or Sephiroth are. FF7 again takes from FF6 in that certain chapters of the game are devoted to fleshing out the backstories of specific characters, including the two optional party members, Yuffie and Vincent. Itself another product of the time, really. The very notion of including completely optional party members is something modern games would likely be terrified of doing. Nowadays, we wouldn't want players to miss a single thing, so everything is signposted in bright neon letters and yellow paint. While characters like Barret, Cid, and Red 13 are important to the overall plot, make no mistake, I feel like the story of the game largely revolves around Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith, and I'm not just talking about the love triangle the game repeatedly teases between them. These three are all intensely likable, and their relationships and chemistry really form the heart and soul of the narrative. Not only that, but FF7 was the first Final Fantasy to get really introspective with its characters. Being released in 1997, this was the first post-Evangelion Final Fantasy game, and anyone who's familiar with Evangelion knows why that matters. The game doesn't just look into the backstories of these characters, but also their psyches and their traumas, Cloud's in particular. I remember one critic at the time saying something like, "Cloud is the most interesting main character in video game history." And back then I can definitely see why that might have been true. Something that I've noticed with these characters over time, though, is that Square seemed to further Flanderize them each time they showed up in a new piece of media. If the only things you had ever seen Cloud in were Dissidia and Kingdom Hearts, you were being shown a very different character than what was in the original game. Somewhere down the line, Square started to present Cloud as though he were the franchise's resident sad sack. And while it's true he's a somewhat surly character with a fair bit of emotional baggage, Cloud in FF7 is also kind of a dork. He's sarcastic, he cracks jokes, he knows how to have fun, and by the end of the game he's the type of guy to say shit like, "Let's mosey." Aerith has, perhaps even more tragically, seemed to receive similar sort of misinterpretation. Over the years, Square, and especially the fandom, seemed to retroactively canonize Aerith as being some pure virginal saint. Looking at you, Crisis Core.
An angel?
No, I'm Aerith.
But in the original game, that's actually pretty far from the truth. She's a sweet and caring girl who's always looking out for people, but she's also a spunky, street-smart tomboy. This is something the remake actually depicted really well, in my opinion. Aerith is playful.
You worry too much. I'm not some princess who needs to be coddled. Shit.
She's sassy, she's a party girl, she likes to tease people and push their buttons. For Christ's sake, it was Aerith who came up with the idea to dress Cloud in drag so they could break into a whorehouse. If anything, it's actually Tifa who fits that virginal saint description a bit more. Despite her sporty clothes and martial arts training, Tifa is actually closer to the sort of submissive caretaker role that people typically try to pin onto Aerith. And speaking of that whole cross-dressing scenario, I sometimes forget how funny this game can be. Even as it presents a grungy dystopian aesthetic, and its villains and side characters being absolute sleazebags a lot of the time, Final Fantasy VII still has a very healthy amount of self-awareness that means it never takes itself too seriously. Seeing Don Corneo, a cartoonishly lecherous crime lord, get his comeuppance via the party members threatening to rip his testicles off is priceless. Running up 60-plus flights of stairs to infiltrate the Shinra building, your party members bitching and moaning the whole time. Hysterical. The invisible love points the game keeps track of can determine who Cloud goes on a date with during the Gold Saucer segment, and if the player fails to properly court any of the 3 female party members, they'll go on a date with Barret instead. He and Cloud sit on the gondola in awkward silence, refusing to speak a word or make any eye contact. Hilarious. Katesith, or Ketchi, or however you want to say it, a fortune-telling cat robot who attacks with a megaphone mounted atop a giant mechanical Moogle, is an absolutely ludicrous concept for a playable party member. At one point, he sacrifices himself, and this is played up so extremely melodramatically, but he's immediately replaced by an identical copy because, of course, there's more than one cat Moogle robot thing sitting around. Is it clunky and awkward and undercuts a major plot point that occurs at exactly the same time? Yes. Is it also really fucking funny? Absolutely. The game's plethora of villains are all intensely memorable in their own ways, too. We all know who Sephiroth is, and while the majority of the game revolves around stopping him, it could be argued that President Shinra, Professor Hojo, and even Professor Gast are the real villains of the story, with Sephiroth even being kind of a victim in a way. The game's writers have said that Sephiroth was meant to invoke the same amount of unseen tension as the shark from Jaws, a constant, ever-present threat that's rarely actually seen, meaning whenever he does show up, the player feels just the right amount of fear. Another thing I think the remake kind of messed up because it's like half an hour in, it's like, hey, Sephiroth's here, look at Sephiroth, it's Sephiroth, isn't he scary? It's Sephiroth, he's talking to you, he's teasing you, it's Sephiroth, 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 Sephiroth. That wasn't in the script, I just felt like ranting. And I don't think I'll ever forget the first time the game shows us Genova's mangled body floating in a pod at Shinra headquarters while that chilling music plays. The story of FF7 makes its themes of environmentalism obvious from the jump, but the other major underlying theme of the game's story is our relationship to Mother Earth, and the game explores that through the lens of grief. The planet gives life to human souls, and human souls upon death return to the planet in a synergistic and beneficial cycle of life. Final Fantasy VII's story was a deeply personal project for series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, who, during the development of Final Fantasy III, was faced with the sudden and tragic death of his mother. In his grief, he sought to explore the nature of life and death within the stories of his games, specifically citing the themes of Final Fantasy VII as another result of this grieving process. The idea that the soul continues on after death, as part of the very planet itself, was no doubt a healing and comforting philosophy for Sakaguchi. And of course, that perhaps best culminates in what has no doubt become the most famous and memorable moment of Final Fantasy VII's story. It's hard to truly convey to younger gamers how truly shocking this was back in 1997. It's likely the most well-known plot twist, the most well-known character death in the history of video games. Although it seems enough time has passed now that there are newcomers to this game who genuinely have no idea, and that thought is existentially terrifying to me. I swear I'm not old, I'm not. And part of what made it so shocking, part of what gave it its impact, is the sheer permanence of it. The game does a great job in this moment of making the player feel an actual sense of loss. Over the years, the ongoing joke within the fandom usually goes, "Oh, you're starting FF7? No spoilers, but don't spend too much time leveling up Aerith." But in this most recent playthrough, as well as the first time I experienced this moment all those years ago, I felt the complete opposite sentiment. I found myself wishing I could go back and spend more time with her in my party. I wished I had used her more, because now I'd never have the chance to again. Through it all, and against all expectations, a video game made me feel a real, tangible sense of heartbreak. It truly did feel like I had lost a friend. There had been character deaths in this franchise before, but none had ever held quite this amount of weight. Mechanically, we just lost a party member we had likely invested hours into leveling up, who also had by far the most universally useful limit breaks in the game. And narratively, we had just lost a character who had shown us nothing but kindness, and who was the only one of the group with the knowledge and the means to thwart the villain. And she was cut down, with no last words nor tearful goodbye, for no reason other than daring to get in Sephiroth's way. And unlike previous character deaths in Final Fantasy games, there was no real way to cope with this loss. She wasn't suddenly revealed to be perfectly fine hours later, like the multiple fake-out sacrifices in FF4. She wasn't immediately replaced with a new party member that inherited all of her stats and abilities, like Kryl in FF5. There wasn't any way to prevent her death ahead of time through the player's actions, like with Shadow in FF6. Aerith was gone, and any of the time we had hoped to spend with her in the future, cut short. And before we're even given the time to properly grieve, we're thrown into a boss battle that, in the moment, we almost feel numb to. Battling a giant alien monster is the last thing we're concerned with right now. Aerith's theme continues to play out even through the fight, reflecting the thought that's at the forefront of our mind that entire time. Aerith is gone, and all we can do is grieve. And as shocking as Aerith's death was, that isn't even really the game's biggest plot twist. The truth of Cloud's backstory and his whole identity crisis is the real mystery that the game's plot is slowly building toward. And it's actually incredible how many people know about Aerith's death, but don't know that Zack exists. As it turns out, Cloud was never in Soldier. His recounts of his time in Shinra's military are mixed with the stories told to him by his friend Zack. After the disaster Sephiroth caused in Nibelheim, Cloud was rendered comatose for years, during which time Hojo repeatedly subjected him to Mako poisoning simply to suit his own twisted scientific endeavors. Cloud's memories and sense of identity have been royally screwed by the excessive amounts of inhumane chemical experiments conducted on him, leaving Cloud's mind a mess. By the time he and Zack break out and find their way to Midgar, Cloud has been physically, mentally, and emotionally broken. Cloud is a young man so intensely damaged by Shinra's psychic torture that he completely assumed another man's persona. This twist, the actual truth of Cloud's past, has somehow remained relatively hidden despite FF7's age and popularity. Everyone knows about Aerith's death, but what's arguably the actual plot twist in this story has miraculously been able to stay somewhat obscure within the cultural zeitgeist of gaming. FF7 also has a noticeably ambiguous ending. Essentially, Sephiroth's plan to crash Meteor into the planet succeeds, and even though our heroes manage to cast Holy to counter it, it looks as though they may be too late. Just as all hope seems lost, the life stream, the river of souls that runs through the planet and acts as its lifeblood, rises up to try to fend off Meteor itself, and we're not shown whether it succeeds or not. We get a vague after-credits stinger that offers no clear answer in one direction or the other, and then that's it. Final Fantasy games traditionally had happy endings, and so to have one that leaves so much up to interpretation is pretty cool. It's actually one reason why the FF7 sequels never sat right with me, because their very existence means Square was now forced to answer these questions. Did the livestream succeed in saving everyone? Yeah, it did. Everyone's fine, mostly. And that kinda takes some of the magic away, right? Also, is it just me, or is Genova not just Lavos from Chrono Trigger again? I get that the two games share writers, and they both were inspired by The Thing, but is this not just the same basic plot, recycled again? No? Am I crazy? The international releases of Final Fantasy VII included a few new features, minor bug fixes, and even new content. Two major quality of life improvements were added, the first of which I mentioned earlier, the pointer that indicates to the player their location, as well as any exits and ladders. The second new feature allows the player to swap materia between characters even if they aren't in your current party. If only there were a way to do so with armor and accessories too, but oh well. Famously, though, two new optional superbosses were added to provide additional challenges for the player to pursue, and to really test their proficiency with the game's battle systems and materia combos. These features would later be repackaged in Japan under the very fitting title of Final Fantasy VII International, which would become a recurring practice in a handful of Square games over the coming generations, such as with the Final Mix versions of various Kingdom Hearts titles. It's no exaggeration to say that Final Fantasy VII is one of the most influential games ever made. Its release almost single-handedly turned the 5th-gen console race in Sony's favor, after the first few years had been a fairly even split between the three main competitors. It's the second highest-selling game on the highest-selling console that generation, and it was the game that finally brought RPGs, specifically Japanese RPGs, into the mainstream, and kicked off the so-called RPG boom that would persist through at least the next decade. Prior to FF7, it was a small miracle to see any given JRPG localized and released in the West at all. The genre was notoriously beefy, resulting in games that took longer to translate and cost considerably more than games of other genres. Even mainline entries in the two leading RPG franchises, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, were not guaranteed to receive international releases, with the latter only seeing half of its numbered entries reach North America, and Europe saw even fewer than that. But in the wake of Final Fantasy VII's success, we would see a huge influx in the number of RPGs being brought over. Much as said in the Brentalfloss song, Square had hit their own limit break. While Square had always been relatively successful within the RPG niche, now they had finally well and truly busted through the wall into the mainstream, and their reputation would quickly reach a peak. For the next several years, Square would be seen as a do-no-wrong studio in the eyes of consumers, similar to what you might see from the likes of, say, FromSoft these days. And of course, RPGs would become one of the most prolific genres of the 5th generation. Almost overnight, RPG fans went from licking up table scraps, counting our blessings if a JRPG made it to US shelves at all, to suddenly being overrun with a veritable tidal wave of role-playing games, no matter how small or obscure, getting official localizations in any attempt to capitalize on the sudden surprise success of FF7. And perhaps one reason why FF7 found such mainstream popularity among the early PlayStation library is that it had a notably more mature tone than other games in the franchise. Unlike prior entries, it wasn't afraid to have characters swearing, and it was also the first Final Fantasy title to show blood. If you manage to win enough brownie points with Tifa over the course of the game, there's even an implied sex scene before the party dives into the final dungeon. Sure, some of the mature moments come off as a little embarrassing in hindsight, like the dumb slap fight between Tifa and Scarlet, or the ridiculous way Tifa's chest moves in a few of the FMVs, but still, FF7 correctly tapped into the trend games were moving toward at the time, that being more adult storytelling. Sony also made the bold and objectively correct decision to retain the game's Japanese numbering in the wake of the franchise's Nintendo era, which had renumbered the games in the States to align with all the ones that were never localized. Of course, that also meant that we now had to explain to people that, no, the franchise didn't just suddenly skip 3 games. I mean, like, it did, but not, like, in a row. Final Fantasy VII's breakaway success well and truly cemented the PlayStation's position as the leader of the 5th console generation, as well as the direction games would take for the near future. In the wake of FF7, we would continue to see games put further emphasis on presenting cinematic, story-driven epics with heavy use of 3D visuals and pre-rendered FMV. It was the first real example of a AAA RPG, an effect that still can be felt to this day, not only among Final Fantasy as a franchise, and not only among RPGs as a genre, but among the gaming medium in its entirety. Is it personally my favorite Final Fantasy game? No. Do I think it's a bit overrated at the end of the day? Perhaps, but none of that changes that it was and still is a fantastic role-playing game, one that forever changed the landscape of the industry. Regardless of any personal opinions I or any of you may have about the game, it simply cannot be denied. Final Fantasy VII is one of the most important video games ever made. It also doesn't have the Velt, so there's that.